Welcome to the Academic Womxn Amplified podcast. I'm your host, Kathy Mazak, tenured full professor, mom of three, and firm believer that the culture of academia needs to change radically. Women are revolutionizing academia within institutions that were not built for us. If you're ready to reject the culture of overwork, kick guilt and overwhelm to the curb, and amplify your voice to make a real impact on your field without breaking down or burning out, you're in the right place. In the summer season of the podcast, we're busting the myth of the quote-unquote traditional path through academia by featuring the life stories of diverse academic women who have created success for themselves on their terms. Get ready to get inspired. Let's go. In today's episode, we talk to Maira Quintanilha. Now, Maira is someone who is so inspiring to listen to. She has had such an interesting path through academia, and part of that path involves being an immigrant herself, coming from her roots in Brazil to do her graduate work in Canada. She worked with mothers in public health and decided to become a mother herself during her PhD program. This is a choice that affected the way she saw her participants, and we really dig into that relationship between qualitative researcher and positionality and how that shifts when you become much more close to the position of the people who you work with in your research, but are still not exactly part of their communities. So we talk about becoming a mother while studying mothers, and we talk specifically about structural inequalities and how we can think about our qualitative work. Maira founded a company after she graduated from her PhD called QualiQ. And at the end of this episode, she tells us how we can get some great free resources for qualitative researchers. Her company trains qualitative researchers and is just starting out. So we get to hear about the story of the birth of her new company and why she decided to leave academia after getting her PhD. I hope you enjoy this episode. Let's start by having you introduce yourself. Tell us your name, your pronouns, your field of study, and what you do now.
Yes. So my name is Maira Quintanilha. I have a PhD in nutrition and metabolism at the University of Alberta. I pronounce she, her. And even though my area and my PhD is in nutrition, I got in-depth training qualitative research methods. Mm-hmm. And that's what I took on for my next step in my career. And I currently have QualiQ, and I help researchers, academics, students to really move through their qualitative projects with confidence and ethics.
Amazing. So I'll just reinstate something that we that we're talking about this summer, which is we're really trying to highlight that all paths in academia are legitimate paths. And so even paths that lead you out or adjacent, right? So I'm so excited to hear your story. Okay, so let's start kind of at the beginning. What were you like as a kid?
It's interesting because I went through this exercise a couple of years ago when I was trying to figure out my next step post PhD. Mm-hmm. And when the coach asked me, what did you like when you were a child? Yeah. And it's interesting because to me, the books, the love for books, and I wasn't necessarily a big reader as a child, but I always enjoyed studying and my notebooks and having 101 stickers and lines that were in different colors, and spent a lot of time with in my homeworks and really in my schoolwork. And I realized that has always been a source of joy for me. Mm-hmm. So when we had to get to that, and she used Gay Hendricks' book, Big Leap.
Yeah.
And when I was thinking about what is my secret sauce or my unique genius, it was really the love for learning. I love learning, and I also love inspiring learning. Yeah. And that really traces back to me as a child. Not a sports kid, not, not not super active, not maybe super fun, but like a very responsible and that really enjoyed books.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you know, or when did you know that college was going to be like something that you did?
Yeah, so I actually didn't say something super important about me, and that's I was born and raised in Brazil. I went to university in Brazil and then moved to Canada where I did my master's and my PhD.
Mhm.
So, being born and raised in Brazil and with lots of privileges, like come from an upper middle class family, I went to good schools and private schools in reality. And I think in Brazil, in that setting or in that environment, there isn't much discussion of whether you or not you're going to college. Like you're going to college, it's more a matter of what you're going to take and
Yeah.
which field you're going to study. So
Mhm.
that was my experience. And I would say that 100% of my friends went to university and finished university. And it's very interesting because it does really reflect my background, like my family background and many of the privileges that I had by being raised in a family that could afford and give me good education. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you decide what you were going to study? Like, do you remember like
Yeah.
making that choice?
I did. I did. And it's interesting because I have discussed this with you before. And it was a hard decision because I was going through a bit of a family crisis when I was in my last year of high school. My mom was going through lung cancer. And I really, being a really great student and having excellent grades, I really considered getting into med school.
Mhm.
And I remember sharing that with my dad. I really think he didn't explore what I was thinking and really discouraged me because he thought it was the circumstances and my worries and my maybe desire to please other family members, including my mom, that was driving that decision. So that's why I really put that on the side. I didn't pursue medicine. I went into nutrition, but when I look back, and there have been many moments, even throughout my PhD, where I realized how doctors have precious encounters that can make such a big difference with women. Because that was my field of study in my PhD, pregnancy and postpartum, maternal health. When I thought about what opportunities they have and how they are really well respected and the advice that comes from those providers make such a big difference for women. I looked back and in a way I thought, I was like, I wish I had a bit more of asking and coaching because I felt I could be making a bigger impact at this point had I gone down that path.
Mhm.
With that being said, I think it's a lesson for me as a mom for the
Mhm.
future.
Mhm.
And but with that being said, I do think that what you just said in the introduction of the podcast is true. Like I have been able throughout my career to really sift through the skills that I have been learning or that I have learned
Mhm.
and to choose the next step with something that I adore and that I have passion for. And I think I would have made a great doctor. I had the grades, I had the interest, I have the heart, but no, and it's funny, a great doctor, not the type of doctor I am, a medical
Right.
doctor. Some people say the real type of doctor.
Right, right, right.
It's interesting, but I think I would have made a great doctor, but that's not where my life went.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and again, like, right. Yeah. Circling back, like all paths are legitimate paths. And I think it's important for people to hear like all the kinds of different decisions that we make and still, have successful, fruitful, cup filling careers.
Completely.
So how did you get to Canada? Like, how did you go from Brazil? You're studying, you're doing nutrition, and then you decide grad school. So what was that decision like?
Yeah, and it's interesting because especially with looking at the world, everything that is happening, like I see the heavy weight of ancestry in how things evolved for me. So
Hmm.
my dad was raised by a farm. Like my grandpa was a wealthy farmer for many years. He lost everything in gambling, which is very sad and part of my family history. But when he was at the peak of his wealth, he sent my dad to England and Spain and France to study languages in the 70s. So
Wow.
my dad always had a passion for study as well. I get a lot of that from him,
Hmm.
and especially for languages. So he saved money, I think, for many, many years as working for the government, not having like that wealth was gone by the time I came around.
Hmm.
But he had saved money for me to come to Canada and study English when I was in my second year of university. So I went to Vancouver and I studied English for 9 months and really enjoyed so many things about Canada and Canadian culture. I
Hmm.
think the freedom that I felt as a young woman was amazing. Anyone who is listening to this, who is from South America or from Brazil, will know that there's a lot of pressure on women, even for how you look, your physical body, your appearance. And I just thought it was so freeing to really not have that and not have anyone ask me like, are you going to the grocery store dressed like that? What if you see your neighbor, or what if you see someone you know? And I think that freedom was really enticing, and the university campus was incredible at UBC, and I just really felt like I wanted to find a way to come back. I
Hmm.
didn't have the means to come and go through university in Canada. It was too expensive and not a possibility. So what I did, I went back to university, and I started really trying to nurture the relationships I had with Canada. And I had met a woman who is a very good friend who was doing her PhD at the U of A.
Hmm.
And I always joke that I always like harass her. We come from the same university, and I had lost touch with her, but I do. And people kept asking me, oh, you were in Canada. Did you see Carla? Like, well, Canada is as huge as Brazil. No, I didn't see Carla because we weren't in the same city. So it's so fun. I was like, oh, you went to Canada? Were you with Carla? So I started reaching out to her and looking for opportunities and just trying to learn from her. And, she says that she gets lots of questions and requests like that.
Hmm.
I think what I did that stood out, and the reason why she helped me so much, was because I always did my homework when I came and looking for answers.
Uh-huh.
I would ask her, like, oh, I looked for this. I don't think I qualify. And in the summer, my summer, so
Hmm.
winter here of 2007, 2008, I had asked her, like, is there any opportunity for me to come and visit and do summer work? And well, then she explained, like, there is no summer internship at this point. Like, we get a small Christmas break, but it's a busy
Hmm.
season. But let me see what I can do. And that's when she put the idea forward to her supervisor, and she said yes. And I came in December 2007. Huge temperature shock of
Wow.
70 Celsius degrees. Like I experienced minus 50 Celsius here for the first time. It is such a shock. But I had an incredible experience in her lab and with her supervisor, and she invited me to come back when I finish my undergrad and start my master's. So like I think the opportunities that Carla opened for me, and her willingness to really be that hand,
Hmm.
were like was definitely instrumental. And also the lab and Linda's invitation was another big factor in where I ended up.
Yeah. That's one of my questions on the little interview protocol is about mentors, right? Like, and that is so,
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like a really important part of your journey was having somebody say, like, I'm going to help you. come over here, and
Yeah.
that's really powerful.
It is. Yeah, it is. And it's something that, like, I look back and I see those women. For me, it has been women, academics and women. And I look at them with so much gratitude, but also it's something that I want to mimic in my career. Like, I have made an effort to be that person for some of the students and even the colleagues that have come across my path and have expressed that interest in learning and hearing. We can learn so much from each other, and I think we can uplift each other more than we sometimes recognize and give ourselves credit for.
Yeah.
So it's huge. I say it's the power of community. And I do believe in mentorship as being huge in someone's, not only drive and dreams, but recognizing what is your next step and what to do next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how, how the master's was. Did you go straight into the PhD? How were you kind of seeing the world in those moments?
You know, like, my master's was with qualitative research, but really at that point, like, a qualitative description. And I had the opportunity to work with schools across Alberta. I have always had an inclination and a lot of joy in public health. And I think that's why now my work really intersects in social and health sciences. I have always, since undergrad, my favorite subjects were the public health ones and understanding social determinants of health and theories that shape our health. So I had a chance to do a qualitative project, yet I wasn't on crazy about doing a PhD. So I finished my master's, and then I pursued my title here, and I became a dietitian in Alberta. And I started working as a dietitian not like less than a year after I had finished my PhD in public health. And I think I was somewhat disappointed with my role in the position, with the opportunities and the projects that I received in that first year. I think, unfortunately, I didn't have a manager who was a mentor, and it was someone that took a long time to trust and delegate. So I felt really underutilized in many ways, but also that my work was not going to be meaningful, or at that point wasn't meaningful. And I started thinking about, I don't like this, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I called my master supervisor, and she was a great mentor. And I told her, we just became permanent residents, and maybe I should go back and do a PhD because, now I wouldn't pay the double amount for tuition.
Right. Yeah.
As if that is a good reason to go and do a PhD. Anyone listening, that's not enough reason to go do a PhD. But that was a factor that I true. And I think she really saw that as the page that she also needed, because they had received a large amount of money with a 5-year grant. And that had one of the arms of the study was going to be led by a well-known qualitative researcher at the U of A, and someone that I admired and that I read the book when I was going through my master's. And Maria Mayen, who is now my biggest mentor, she was going to be the leading the study, the qualitative arm. And Linda, when she talked to me on the phone, she said, you would have a chance to do what you enjoy the most, which is qualitative research.
Yeah.
So think about it and let me know. And things kind of went from there. And I started so that conversation was in the summer. I kind of wrapped up my position, gave my notice, and I started in January 2014. Yes.
Nice.
So it's interesting how I definitely didn't go master's PhD or direct to a PhD.
Right.
And I wouldn't say it was the passion for academia that took me back to a PhD. It was more running from a career that I didn't think was for me. But I definitely am so thankful for everything I have learned throughout my PhD. And I really enjoyed my study and my experience. And I definitely something that now when I look at my life, like I really don't see like what would have happened if I didn't do a
Right.
PhD. Hard to know, like that's what happened. But I am absolutely grateful for the project, for the mentorship that I received, and for the learning that
Yeah.
and the growing pains. Because doing a PhD is
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
painful at many
Yeah.
points. Yeah.
Yes. So I want to talk about like, well, or I want to let you decide, like kind of where we go next. If you want to talk about the actual like meat and potatoes of what you were studying. But I also know that part of your story is having applied and gotten funding for your PhD, and that was something that really changed the way you were able to kind of be as a student and decisions that you made
Mm-hmm.
in your life. So where do you want to go next? Do you want to talk a little bit about what you were actually working on during the PhD, or and then
Mm-hmm. Like let's try to do a bit of both.
okay.
So when I started in January 2014, I knew that I was going to be under that arm of the study
Mhm.
that was the qualitative work.
Mhm.
And we were doing community-based participatory research with immigrant and refugee women during pregnancy and postpartum. So it is very interesting because if you think where I sit in terms of my applications and where my proposal for funding went,
Mhm.
I always applied and I was in a health
Yeah.
sciences faculty. Actually, it's interesting because nutrition, where I am, is actually in agriculture. So you can see like a positivist paradigm, so very technical, objective, hypothesis driven
Mhm.
science experiment. And there I was with a project that was 100% qualitative, community based, which means messy
Yeah.
and evolving and
Mhm.
not necessarily knowing how things will go
Mhm.
and having to make decisions for a proposal so that I could write a good proposal and not be disadvantaged from that point. In January 2014, when I had my first application submitted, an award that was university but went through the department adjudication process, I didn't get it. And I asked to get feedback from the committee and I got to have that feedback. And it was from a male professor that does bioengineering. And he tore my application apart in all ways you can imagine. He talked about how the paragraphs were too long, that I didn't have white space, that nothing was in bullets, that I didn't have a hypothesis, that he couldn't understand the value of my research based on what was there. And it really made me realize that not everyone is educated and they don't know what they don't know about qualitative research.
Mhm.
And you need to understand that. And I think that's one of the things that I started understanding. I had to be truthful to what I knew and what I needed to put in a proposal about qualitative research.
Mhm.
But I also understood from very early that some of the people who were going to read my proposal would have that bias
Yeah.
and that their views about qualitative research weren't going to be fair from the get-go.
Right.
So it was discouraging. But then later on in the year, I had this amazing talk from another male professor, but in nursing, Dr. Alex Clark. He actually has a book called The Happy Academic. And his talk was super inspiring. And he talked about qualitative research, like how do you write a strong proposal, how do you show your theoretical perspective, and you build your introduction and your lit review in a way that really shows that need for your project. And I just left that workshop super inspired, and I did work very, very hard in my proposal in that summer.
Mhm.
And I got a Venier, which is one of the most prestigious PhD awards in Canada. And it has given me the freedom to really enjoy my PhD, to feel more empowered as a graduate student, and to really do things in my life, including having children during my PhD, because I had that financial stability. And it's huge. Like, it's huge. Anyone who asks me now about how did I manage to do my PhD and have two children, I really try to be super sincere and say how that financial privilege is one of the reasons why I was able to do it. It's very challenging in many ways because you often feel like you're doing what no one else is doing by having kids during your graduate program. And if you don't have a good support system, it's challenging. And if you don't have the financial stability, it is even more stressful. And someone who does study food insecurity, because that was part of my PhD, I do understand how prevalent food insecurity is among university students, and especially postgraduate students who have children.
Wow.
Who are women, especially if they are single and have children. So it's not to say that definitely those life and dreams were accomplished with a big part because of the financial support as well.
Yeah. So talk a little more about that decision, like to have kids during your PhD. How did that go over with like the professors you were working with?
It's interesting because I have two supervisors. One who is a qualitative researcher, mother of three boys, and another one who's more of a bench scientist and who did not have children. And we were doing a pregnancy study, right?
Right.
We were under, and REACH was all about promoting maternal health during pregnancy and postpartum. We never had that discussion. If I had to say how it went, like when I announced I'm pregnant, I think I got a bit more of an excited response from Maria versus Rhonda. But with that being said, I think we have all learned so much throughout that project. And if I had, like, in all sincerity, there were times that were really hard to face people and to feel that awkwardness in how that decision is almost perceived as you taking a hit in your career or in what you could become. I remember the award was officially announced in March 2015. March 31st, 2015. I'll never forget, because it's like one of those moments in your life that you don't forget how it feels. And I found out I was pregnant on April 4th, 2015, very early in my first trimester. And I remember the award ceremony was in September, so I was very pregnant at that point. And the dean of our department looked at me. He couldn't really hide. Like, he looked at my huge bump, that 30-week almost pregnant, and was like, "So when did that happen?" And I was like, "What?" I could see in his eyes and the timeline trying to kind of like work in his head. And now that I'm really trying to put language to things that happened to me and like assign terms, I think that's a microaggression. Like, I can't dismiss that. And why? Like, would you ask that? Like, if it was a male that had his wife pregnant, like, would you ask, like, when did that happen? Like, what are you talking about? Like, exactly here, right?
Yeah.
So there were moments like that. And it's easy not to pay attention to them. But then at the same time, I think it's also super important to pay attention to them, to acknowledge, to reflect, to work through them, because I think they can cause a lot of pain. I had someone in the research team ask me if the scholarship was going to pay the study for the time that I was off, which makes no sense, right? Like,
No.
yeah, so unemployment insurance or maternity leave is not paid to the employer, it's paid to the person who goes
Right.
and has time off. So you can see how being the cheap labor or the student that's sometimes like carrying a lot of the workload and being self-funded, you're kind of expected not to step away at any moment because that means the study needs to pay someone else to do what you were going to do. So
Right.
there were many of those moments, but overall, I think having had that mentor, like having had Maria since the beginning, being supportive throughout my pregnancy, and knowing from my department, from people inside the graduate program, and also inside the larger faculty of grad studies, I had people who were like, this is your mat leave, this is your money, and you don't have to feel bad about stepping away for 6 months and not doing any work because that's your time.
Yeah.
And I took it and I really, and that's the thing, like being someone who enjoys the work as much as I do. I had publications under review and I did those reviews, no problem. But I know from the environment where I am, I know students who have been asked to do things when they weren't ready to do things.
Right.
Or they were asked to do things without the acknowledgement of, I know this is your time. How do you feel about doing this?
Right.
Do you feel you can take this on? It was more that like, this is due. Can you do this? Like,
right. Like, oh, you're home doing
not
nothing.
Right.
Yes.
Yes.
This assumption that you're doing nothing. And I just want to point out for listeners in different parts of the world how awesome Canada is in this respect. There may be other, it's a complex place, but one thing that is good is that somebody who's a graduate student gets maternity leave. Like that is something that we all could take some notes on.
Absolutely. Because you're in the US, not even like women in the US don't get a decent maternity leave. I'm in Canada. That gives me like a lot of privilege. Like compared to my peers who work, I have a shorter maternity leave because I had 6 months. And I know a lot of people who will be listening to this will be like, wow, 6 months.
Yeah.
In Canada, women are having the choice now of having 12 or 18 months, depending on what you can take in terms of the pay, right? It's not perfect. The system overall still really, in a way, punishes people or women who want to do certain things during their mat leave because you have to be careful with your taxes. You might have problems with the unemployment, not the unemployment, the employment insurance. So it's complex still, but very, very, it's a big privilege, an undeniable privilege when you look at so many other parts of the world.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. And again, like just thinking about having that support, both through your fellowship or, like the funding that you got, but also knowing that there's like some built-in support. It just makes those choices like different choices than other people would have in other situations. So how did like becoming a mom affect your outlook on maternal health and nutrition? Like you are now like embodying literally something that you've been studying for a long time. So what was that like to have those two things kind of crash into each other?
Yeah. It was really humbling in many ways and life-changing. So I do qualitative research and as I am learning more and more about language and calling out racism and inequalities and being able to recognize that even within myself, like where things are coming from. It was very humbling for many reasons. So I had groups of immigrants and refugees in the urban area in Edmonton, and I worked with Black women from Northeast Africa. And I learned from them what it meant to lose the we culture that they were used to back in Northeast Africa. So they described their culture as we cultures, where they had that support system and they never felt they were raising their children by themselves. It was a village that raised a child versus an I culture here.
Right.
And I understood that because I come from a more of a we culture as well.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have a child, you really understand. And it made me sad to imagine their pain in losing that support
Yeah.
by coming here, especially when their perception of children as blessings and their choices of having multiple children puts them at an even more difficult situation because you don't have your support system. You're raising your kids without your community, and you're having to navigate a system that is not fair to you.
Right.
And it's it was humbling in that sense and sad in many instances where there was a point in 2014 where I struggled with depression and I was at the peak of my data collection.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember seeing my family doctor and telling him, I think I need to make a decision to go back to Brazil before we have children. I don't think we should stay here. I see I don't see how I can go through motherhood away from my support system. So I think that really speaks to how I was going through that suffering in that lamenting what I was seeing in my participants,
Mm-hmm.
but still not fully understanding that from my own experience. So when I had babies, when I had my first,
Mm-hmm.
I think I became definitely more compassionate with their situation. And my first, so I also had a group in rural Alberta,
Mm-hmm.
and there were more white women, but there were also some immigrants, especially from Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember that those groups, one of the biggest factors and adversities for them was having complications, pregnancy and birth complications that led them to almost be displaced from their hometown and communities to go to larger centers with the expectation that they could afford the travel, that they could afford the stay, that they could afford the childcare back in rural Alberta.
Mm-hmm.
And I had my first child had seizures after he was born. So there was probably hypoxia happened at some point during birth,
Mm-hmm.
during my delivery. And he had seizures and was in the NICU for a few days and had to go through a lot of tests. And I think that was one of the biggest moments for me also to understand in all the privileges that I had, the suffering was hard to measure and to describe. And when I thought about what that really meant for someone who had no financial privilege, who had to travel, who had structural policies putting them at a disadvantage, how hard that would have been.
Yeah.
And not that I could ever imagine, but that really, it's a big wake up call.
Yeah.
So I think having had my babies really changed how I looked at the data and how I looked at what is happening and what was happening with the women that I did research with. I joked, like I had fatigue at many points during my PhD with the data and the type of work that I was doing. But now I look at that and I wish, like, there was a point in 2017 when I was doing food insecurity work with the Somali community.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably had the most depressing interviews of my whole life. And they were most depressing because they were just inequality after inequality right in your face. Like how you are at the disadvantage for being a refugee, for being Black, for being from Somalia, from being judged because you have many children, all those things. That intersectionality is just huge. And I remember telling someone in my qualitative community how I needed to do happy qualitative research. But now, as a qualitative researcher, I was like, no, you just needed a break from the discomfort and the sadness, and you needed to catch your breath. But there is no such thing as happy qualitative research, as you're investigating human experience, and there will be pain, and there will be joy, and there will be compassion, and there will be the understanding that what's happening is happening. So that's why I always say, like, my PhD has been incredible in terms of that human experience for me as a researcher, and for the growing pains, and for experiencing pain, moving through pain in personal and professional areas at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I think that's something like that as qualitative researchers, like we have to deal with all the things. And that we also, one of the beautiful things about being a qualitative researcher, though, is that your positionality is part of it. Like you don't have to pretend that you're not affected. You don't have
Yeah.
to pretend like put this like fake objectivity on things because qualitative research gives the researcher the space to be a person inside of
Yes.
the research as well.
Yeah. And the other big thing, like another arm of the study in my PhD, was with Indigenous women. So I really had sort of a crash course in Indigenous history in
Mhm.
Canada, an exposure that I feel so blessed to have had, because I had a chance to attend powwows and ceremonies that I know most of my peers have never like experienced. And having that understanding has helped me to really navigate the biggest, I think, problem in racism that exists in Canada, which is a bit different from the US.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because what is happening in the world now, with everyone like discussing race and racism and how to be an anti-racist, I think qualitative researchers do have an advantage, because we have that understanding that we are subjective beings, that we need to put our positionality on paper or write about it or talk about it, and not ignore it.
Yeah.
And what I think has been a big issue in health sciences, I'm going to talk about health sciences in particular, is that, in my opinion, so this is my opinion, that fake perception of objectivity. Like
Mm.
you think you're objective, but you're not. And it's interesting because when you look at even who are the people who are being studied in big maternal projects, here, who is coming to the university for lab tests and for physical activity and a lot of the studies? It's the white, high socioeconomic status, privileged woman. We have
Mm.
not made an effort to do inclusion criteria or to do recruitment strategies that really go above and beyond to make sure we are capturing the health of all women. So that whole objectivity and going and thinking you're being objective by following and having your project approved by IRB is a fallacy. And I think if we don't start seeing that in the health sciences, you're not going to move forward and help all the people, or enlighten us about what is really happening with the health of all. Um, so
Wow,
it's
that
interesting.
and powerful. Like let's rewind, everybody rewind that and listen to that again because that was that was like that's a very powerful critique and well timed, right? Like and this is we really need to be thinking about that exactly now. So one of the things I wanted to kind of piggyback there about was like right now we're recording on June 9th. And so we've been watching the world protest, like floods the streets during a pandemic about standing up and saying Black Lives Matter. And how connected what's happening at this historical moment is to what you just said, like in terms of public health, like that we have the statistics coming out, or they're not even being kind of countable statistics about how coronavirus has disproportionately affected certain communities, and especially including the Black community in the States. So,
Mhm.
that connection between public health and racism, right, is really deep and old. And we're seeing it so clearly right now.
Mhm. It is. And when I just told you all of that, and one of the things that I look at my thesis and I see a bit of a failure. I have shared my research positionality and paradigm with my positionality with you. I
Mhm.
wrote that after being asked during my exam about having children during my PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So acknowledging everything that happened in my life during my PhD, and when I did my data collection versus analysis. And I know for some people that I have shared this, they say like that's absurd. Like that's saying that a woman couldn't have her data collection while pregnant. But if you are a qualitative researcher, you understand that you need to acknowledge those things. You're not being singled out. It's not a matter, it's not prejudice. It's basically putting where you were and grounding yourself in your positionality at that point in your career. But I look at my lead review and I see how, as much as I recognize the importance of a paradigm and where I was, I see my background in health sciences come out strong,
Mm-hmm.
and how much of the data that I showed was not really filtered and criticized or analyzed and interpreted through a gender lens, through a race lens.
Mm-hmm.
How I showed those facts and I tried to still have that objectivity,
Mm-hmm.
because I was really navigating health sciences and the developmental origins of health and disease, and moving all the way through the social sciences and what empowerment means and self-efficacy. So you can see that like struggle even within myself, and how now when I look, I see failures in recognizing and in really showing how it all happens in a woman's body. And then we are often the target of all the studies and all that needs to be done. But where is everyone else, right? Where is that father role, whoever that person is, and where is the community role, and where is everyone else? So it was also some of the criticisms, or like constructive, I would say very constructive criticisms that I had during my exam. Like, did you realize, that was basically the question, how gender is meeting as a huge social determinant of health here?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't. And I would add race to that, because
Yeah.
I definitely didn't acknowledge that on top of my women, and I say my women with a lot of pride, but they're not mine, of course, but my
Mm-hmm.
participants, like my groups, I really didn't go deep into that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what were the additional struggles and adversities that North East African women had
Mm-hmm.
because of the color of the skin?
Yeah.
Because they weren't immigrants like me that can
Right.
just blend, right?
Right.
Like, as a Latino woman, I can blend. My husband can't because he's biracial, but I can, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting. It's something that when I see everything that is happening and I see people demonstrating fatigue, what I say now, and I seriously, last week was exhausting. I'm not gonna lie, like it's been hard. But then I was talking to a group of friends, like in the business world, and we are talking, and she used the analogy of a choir. Like, we'll have moments. I have had moments as a qualitative researcher that I had to catch my breath and I had to step away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we'll have moments like that. But if you're feeling that things are going back to normal or what they were before, maybe that's a sign that something is really not going in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. How do
Mm-hmm.
you think, like, I'm glad you brought up that idea of like going back to normal. I think that that has been ever since, coronavirus started, people have been talking about going back to normal. And then other people have
Yeah.
been saying there's not going to be a normal. Now, with this kind of huge uprising around George Floyd's murder, the last drop, right? That has brought awareness to some people who weren't aware before of how they need to be more anti-racist. There's not going to be another in academia. We cannot go back to quote unquote normal. Like, we can't go back to what we were doing before. So how do you see like your work maybe in QualiQ, or your kind of
Mm-hmm.
next steps right now contributing to how we could be more anti-racist in academia?
Well, in within my work in PolyQ, I'm developing now the program, and it's called Qualitative Research Blueprint. It's an online course that I'm launching in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad in a way that this all happens now when I am developing the course, because I have been able to put words to my biggest desire as a qualitative researcher, especially in health, and that is to make people more reflective in their qualitative research.
Mm-hmm.
The way I am hoping to really take my work and make a meaning of everything that is happening is really hammering that message that no matter what qualitative methods you're using, or no matter what methodology you're studying, or I see the methods as the tools to do the research, the methodology like the bigger.
Yep.
You have an epistemology, like you see the world in a certain way, like how you understand knowledge is created. And I am really going to encourage the students in that course to take that time for reflection about where did you come from, and like who is your ancestry, like what did you learn as a child, like what have you learned in your training about this. And if you have never had any exposure to theory, I am not a theory expert, but I want people to understand whether or not they need to do a bit more research with theories and paradigms, and to not be afraid of positioning themselves. That's the biggest thing that I really want. It's okay. Like if you are still if you're ready to claim that you're one thing, that's fine. I think that the neutrality and not being comfortable with the claim is where I really want to discourage the students to be.
Yeah.
And it's not always easy. And I think one thing that I have learned in this past week is, and that is from Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. He says that how you're not always one thing. You will be racist in certain moments, anti-racist in other moments. And I think as someone who is really taking on that role of mentorship and trying to do a bit of a change in the health, especially space, I want people to become more attuned to how that feels in their body, how that feels in their mind, and what that means in terms of their research. And to really be compassionate with their participants, but also be compassionate with themselves, because otherwise you're going to lose your breath and step away and just give up. But I think if we're talking about sustainability of even like this uprising and this awakening, we really need to encourage the almost like the new generations, like the people who are going through undergrad in academia, to have more of that. So it's a long process, and I am not necessarily in that space to bring about that change, but I do believe that it's never too late. It's later than yesterday, but it's sooner than tomorrow, right? So whatever I try to do is really with that intent of awakening. And I have really the other piece of this that I have, and maybe if someone listening can say like that's self-massaging the ego and it's my privilege, but I try to look at that self-comparison idea, and that's something that Brené Brown talks a lot. I have had one, and you know about this, Kathy, like with my daughter. My daughter had cancer as a baby, and she had a cancer with good prognosis, and she made it, and she's healthy and well. And I had times in my life in the last few years where I struggled with my pain, but I struggled even more with the idea that I have it good, right? I didn't lose my child, and I didn't, and it was probably one of the hardest things. I didn't know how to move forward, knowing that I get to keep my baby, and some of the people that I met didn't. And one of the things that I have learned by working with my counselor and by understanding the comparative suffering is the best way for me to honor the suffering of the parents that didn't get to keep their babies is to being grateful for what I have and recognizing that it could be different. So in a way, I am really trying in my imperfection and in my learning to transfer that to what is happening now and moving forward. As much as possible, in all moments, recognize my privileges and also those that don't have to have those privileges. And that's something that I am really looking forward to doing with the students that will come on board in the fall, is that embracing discomfort and learning to work through that, because it's hard and it should be hard. Like, it's not like, it's not overnight, and it's not like, we're not talking about color of shoes, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Like, I just have really enjoyed our conversation in the past hour. I love how it went, and so glad that you're willing to kind of share your story and your perspective with everyone on the podcast. Tell us a little bit about how we can find out more about you and about QualiQ. And there might be people wanting to sign up for the course in the fall. So give us a little info about that.
Yeah, sure. So QualiQ, www.qualiq.ca. I can send the links and you can put in the show notes. You can find me in all social media, and we do also have a private Facebook group called QualiQ for Qualitative Minds. And I come live every Wednesday and kind of look at the blog posts that I wrote for the week and have a bit more discussion about them. And just join if you're doing qualitative research, and be really mindful of course, my background and my own paradigms and all of that. But I think community is huge in learning and growing and in being a qualitative researcher. Because when you need to catch a breath, it's easier to catch a breath if you have other people alongside you to support you. And the program QRB will be coming around in September, and I am super excited about it. It's been definitely a lot of work creating, especially amid everything that is happening. And if you're interested, anyone who's listening, if you think that would be for you, make sure that you sign up for our newsletters or you download some of the resources you have, because then you'll hear when it comes out. And there will be, I think, a lot of really good conversations that will happen with the material and how it will be offered.
Great. Wonderful. Yes, we'll link everything up in the show notes. And again, thank you so much for being with us today, Maira. It was wonderful talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending your valuable time investing in yourself and your career by listening to this episode. If you'd like to continue the conversation, join the over 13,000 academic women and non-men folks in the I Should Be Writing Facebook group. Just go to facebook.com/groups/I Should Be Writing or search for I Should Be Writing inside your Facebook app. See you inside.